talking about that the media never asks people in the square is, why are you against the corporations? How have they hurt you? They would get a lot of material. They would get a lot of material. If you talk to people, there are a lot of stories of oppression. You know, these young people, many of them, what differentiates it from the 60s for me is that a large part of the movement was a student movement and it had privilege. You know, not everywhere, but a lot of it, some of it came out of Harvard, you know. The working class kids often didn't have the luxury of engaging in so much movement stuff, except like in the civil rights movement, it's a whole other story.
But even now, we have a white paper that we've been trying to put around these channels by one of the presidents of the Federal Reserve, saying, you know what, those banks are too big, and they should fail, and they should be broken up into local banks.
The people who are there now, a lot of them are young people who are unemployed, underemployed, or putting together a couple of part-time jobs. The reason they can be there is they're unemployed, underpaid, and they feel that their grievances are similar to the grievances of the working poor of all races.
And we have free food.
Yeah, there are people who really are bringing real survival needs to the...
I'd also like to point out that the media keeps saying that there's 200 people there. First of all, on Friday morning, there was at least 450 people there at 7 o'clock in the morning. Because I know, because I counted 250 people the week before, and there was way more than double that on Friday morning when I woke up. Even that is only the tip of the iceberg. There's a constantly rotating stream of people coming in and out. There's all of us that work at home all the time in support of numerous things. I mean, why do you put this picture together? You were in the park? Right?
No.
Okay.
We had a very nice organization that housed us for a few days so that we could put together the paper with a bunch of media professionals, and Chris Hedges has an article in it in support of it, saying that if you are not on the side of Occupy Wall Street, you will be on the wrong side of history. So, yeah, so there's an enormous, tremendous nationwide effort happening right now.
I wanted to talk, if it's okay now, a little bit analytically about a kind of wider historical context. I was very excited when I saw that the teachers in Madison were occupying the Capitol. I got in the car and my husband and I drove out there because I come out of Madison. And when I heard that it was the graduate teaching assistants that had led the takeover of the Capitol, and I was there when the graduate teaching assistants formed the first union of graduate teachers assistants and shut down the university in a strike for recognition that was supported by all the students because they made it also into a strike against the war. It was the time of the incursion into Cambodia, and it inspired the people who work in the cafeterias to go out on the strike for recognition. That is one of the main sources of Bloombergville and of this encampment. They were at a point when they were removed from the Capitol, which has a rule, like this park, that they're supposed to be able, as the public, to be there at any time. But at a certain point, they came up with some reason. They built a tent city outside the building and called it Walkerville after Governor Walker, who was taking away their collective bargaining rights, and after the Hoovervilles of the 30s, and that's where we got the inspiration for Bloombergville, which then fed into Occupy Wall Street. The movement of the 60s was largely a youth movement. A lot of it was middle class, although there was a lot of people who had dropped out of the middle class. What we have now are people who've been either working class or been pushed out of the middle class. A lot of them tell me that they're not going to live the way their parents lived. That they have college degrees, they can't get those kind of jobs anymore. Madison was unusual, and I think this is part of the history that led to the takeover of the Capitol, in that the student movement was a labor movement as well as a youth movement. And in fact, one of the leaders of the teaching assistants at that time eventually became head of the AFL-CIO in Wisconsin. David Newby. And David did his research on, revolutionary French workers and, and led the AFL-CIO, which was an anti-war AFL-CIO. So there was a tradition there. The other thing is that we talked a lot about the Third World in the 60s because we had the Vietnam War, but the connection now is much closer since Tahrir Square. We're Skyping with them, talking with them all the time, we're learning from their tactics, they're telling us what to do. The connection with globalization, it's a whole different connection between our domestic population and the Third World. In the 60s, a lot of the unions were not sympathetic to struggles around support for national self-determination. But since their jobs have been exported to these countries to get cheap labor, they have begun to understand you need an international labor movement. And one of the first groups to support Occupy Wall Street were the unions in Egypt that wrote to us. So it's a different situation, but there are traditions. In between, why did the movement not go further? It's a question I've asked myself, a million times. Things got harder after the 60s. I lived on the Lower East Side for $45 a month. A year I took off from graduate school. Now that apartment would cost me, I don't know, $1,000, $2,000. And the austerity has gotten much worse, and during the period between the 60s and now, you couldn't take off from school so easily. You couldn't support yourself the way I did, working one day a week to organize on the Lower East Side. So that austerity, there was an attack on the people that set back the movement. There wasn't a total big chill. It's people like Mimi who've been out there the whole time, and I've been involved for 45 years. It didn't all go away. But now, there are differences. Because the austerity is much worse, because there's a proletarianization, even of college professors. My union is one of those progressive unions in the city, and it was the first union to come to Occupy Wall Street. And we've endorsed it. Because we're facing budget cuts and attacks all the time, and attacks on our union. Just one other point, which is there is tremendous support in the General Assemblies for the struggles of workers. I make reports every day on what this working group on reaching out to and supporting workers is doing. And there's great excitement about it. And what's happened now is that the labor unions have gotten excited about it. They see a potential. They see a potential, a way that the most progressive forces in the labor movement can form a coalition around involvement with Occupy Wall Street. I've been talking to them about that. I've been talking to people at the TWU who may be breaking the Taylor Law again in a couple of months and will need a lot of support. They have also taken more radical positions. Trump, the head of the AFL-CIO, rails against the corporations now, rails against the 1% and their tax breaks. So it is much easier to relate to the labor movement than we did when the labor movement under Meany and then Kirkland was pro-war.
We'd like to introduce the late coming panelists. Vlad had Teichberg? Yes, okay, great. Is a media activist. We're so honored. He's a former derivatives trader, credit derivatives specialist for 15 years, and among many other things, he set up one of our biggest tools, which is the Global Revolution live stream, which, as you see, is streaming live right now. These are people who are marching downtown, and these are all the people who are talking about it all over the world at this point. And right now we have 5,200 viewers and growing. So if you'd like to speak to that.
Yeah. I'll tell you just a brief history of how this came to be and where it's going, in the context of not just this occupation of this action on Wall Street, which is basically take the square action, and other take the square actions which are happening around the world and have been happening since the Arab Spring began. So I can only speak from personal experience. I'm not an academic, I'm a practitioner.